The snow had started falling at dawn, dusting the streets of Portland with a soft white blanket that muffled the usual city sounds. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the flakes dance past the streetlights, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 62, she had grown accustomed to quiet mornings like these, the stillness of her Victorian home a companion she'd learned to appreciate over the decades, but this morning felt different. The envelope on her kitchen table seemed to pulse with an energy all its own, even though it had been sitting there unopened for 3 days. She knew the handwriting. Even after 30 years, she would recognize those careful, slanting letters anywhere. Elena. Margaret, single quotes S. Chest tightened as she finally approached the table, setting down her mug with trembling hands. The return address was from Sacramento, a city she'd only visited once. During that painful summer of 1994 when she'd driven down to help Elena pack her life into boxes. To hold her one last time before everything fell apart, she slid her finger under the envelope's seal, the paper giving way with a soft whisper. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery. And as Margaret unfolded it, she caught the faintest hint of jasmine. The perfume Elena had always worn. Dearest Margaret, I know I have no right to reach out after all these years. I know the silence between us has been my doing, my choice, my cowardice. But I'm writing to you now because I've learned that life is too short to leave the most important words unspoken. I'm coming back to Portland for Christmas. My daughter Sarah is getting married here on December 28th, and I'll be in town for 2 weeks. I don't expect anything from you. I don't expect forgiveness or even acknowledgement. But if there's any part of you that might want to see me, to talk, to perhaps find some closure or peace after all this time, I'll be at the Christmas market in Pioneer Courthouse Square on December 23rd at 2 p.m. I'll wait by the big tree. If you don't come, I'll understand. I'll carry on knowing I at least tried to reach across the years to the woman who once knew me better than I knew myself. With love and regret. Elena. Margaret's hands shook as she read the letter twice more, then a third time. Each word felt like a small earthquake, shifting the carefully constructed foundation of the life she'd built in Elena's absence. She walked to the living room and sank into her favorite armchair, the leather worn soft from years of use. And let the memories flood back. Part 2, 1992. They had met at a bookstore reading in the summer of 1992. Margaret had been 32. A newly minted professor of English literature at Portland State University. Still finding her footing in academia and in herself. Elena had been 34, a photographer whose work was just beginning to gain recognition. Her black and white portraits capturing something raw and true about the human experience. The author that night had been forgettable. But Margaret remembered standing in line for the restroom during the intermission and finding herself next to a woman with dark curly hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes the color of warm honey. Elena had been wearing a leather jacket over a simple white shirt, and when she smiled at Margaret, it felt like the room had suddenly become brighter. Did you like the reading? Elena had asked. Margaret had laughed. Honestly, I found it a bit pretentious. But don't tell anyone I said that. Elena's smile had widened. Your secret's safe with me. I'm only here because my friend is the manager and guilt-tripped me into coming. I'm Elena, by the way, Margaret. They had talked through the rest of the reading, whispering in the back row like schoolgirls, and when the event ended, Elena had suggested they continue their conversation over coffee. That coffee had turned into dinner into a walk through the lamplit streets of Northwest Portland. And by the time they said goodbye at 2 in the morning, Margaret knew her life had just changed forever. Their romance had unfolded like a secret garden coming into bloom. In 1992, Portland was more progressive than many cities, but being openly gay still carried risks, whispers, and judgment. Margaret had been out to her close friends but cautious at work, aware that her position as a young female professor was precarious enough without adding another layer of potential controversy. Elena had been more open, her artistic circles generally accepting, but she too understood the need for discretion. They fell in love slowly and then all at once. Margaret would show up at Elena's studio with takeout and watch her work, mesmerized by the way Elena could capture emotion in the tilt of a head, the shadow beneath an eye. Elena would attend Margaret's lectures, sitting in the back row. And afterward they would debate Austen and Woolf and Morrison over wine in Margaret's apartment. They traveled together, taking weekend trips to the coast where they could hold hands on empty beaches without worrying who might see. They created a life together that felt both thrilling and comfortable, passionate and peaceful. Margaret had never imagined she could be this happy, this fully herself, but they never lived together. Margaret had her apartment near the university, Elena had her studio loft downtown. They never used the word partner in public, never attended work events together, never posted photos where anyone could see. It was a compromise that allowed them to have their love while still maintaining the separate, acceptable lives the world seemed to require. Margaret had told herself she was fine with it. She had told herself that what they had in private was enough. Part 3, The Unraveling. The cracks began to show in early 1993. Elena's mother had fallen ill in Sacramento, and Elena had started making more frequent trips home. Each time she returned, she seemed a little more distant, a little more weighted down by something she wouldn't quite articulate. One evening in May, Margaret had made dinner. A Spanish feast with paella and sangria, Elena's favorites. They had been sitting on Margaret's small balcony, the spring air warm and fragrant with blooming jasmine from the neighbor's yard. When Elena had finally spoken the words that would begin their unraveling, "My mother asked me when I'm going to settle down and give her grandchildren." Margaret had tensed. They had never directly discussed children, though Margaret had assumed, perhaps naively, that it wasn't something either of them wanted. "What did you tell her?" Elena had been quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in her glass. "I didn't know what to say. Because the truth is, Margaret, I've been thinking about it. About what it would mean to have a family. A traditional family." The word traditional had hung in the air between them like a blade. "You mean a family with a man," Margaret had said. Her voice carefully neutral even as her heart began to crack. Elena had looked at her then, and Margaret had seen tears in those honey-colored eyes. "I don't know what I mean. I just know that my mother is dying, and she's never met anyone I've dated because I've been too afraid to tell her the truth about who I am. I know that I'm 35 years old, and sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night terrified that I'm living the wrong life." "The wrong life?" Margaret had repeated, the words like ash in her mouth. "Is that what I am to you? The wrong life?" "No," Elena had said quickly, reaching for Margaret's hand. "God, no. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. You're the most right thing. But the world doesn't see it that way, does it? And I'm tired, Margaret. I'm so tired of hiding and pretending and living in the margins." They had talked late into the night, both of them trying to find a solution that didn't exist. Margaret had argued that things were changing, that they could build a life together openly if they were brave enough. Elena had countered that bravery required something she wasn't sure she had anymore. Not with her mother dying and her family pressuring her, and the weight of expectation crushing her from all sides. Over the following months, they had tried to hold on. But Elena's visits to Sacramento became longer, and when she was in Portland, there was a distance between them that no amount of physical closeness could bridge. She started talking about a man she'd met through her family, Robert. A widow with a kind smile and a stable job as an accountant. "He's nice," Elena had said one August evening, and Margaret had known in that moment that she was losing her. "Nice," Margaret had repeated, the word bitter. "Is that really what you want, nice?" Elena had started crying then, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. "I don't know what I want anymore. I only know that loving you is the hardest thing I've ever done, not because of who you are, but because of who the world tells me I'm supposed to be." Elena had moved to Sacramento in December of 1993, supposedly to help care for her mother full-time. Margaret had known it was more than that. It was an escape, a retreat back to the safety of expectations and normalcy. They had tried to maintain contact at first. Late-night phone calls where they would talk about everything except what mattered. Letters that grew increasingly infrequent. But by spring of 1994, Elena had written to say she was engaged to Robert. The wedding would be that summer. Margaret had driven to Sacramento one last time in July, unable to stay away even though she knew it was masochistic. They had met at a cafe, and Elena had looked beautiful but somehow diminished, as if she were wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. "Are you happy?" Margaret had asked, meaning to know even though she was afraid of the answer. Elena had twisted the engagement ring on her finger. "I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. What everyone expects. And there's a certain peace in that and not fighting anymore." That's not the same as being happy. Maybe happiness isn't the point, Elena had said softly. Maybe survival is. They had held each other in the parking lot, both of them crying, and Margaret had kissed her one last time, tasting salt and regret and the ghost of what they'd been. I will always love you, Elena had whispered. Even when I'm 80 years old and can barely remember my own name, I will remember loving you. Then why are you leaving? Margaret had asked, but Elena had just shaken her head, unable or unwilling to answer. But it had been 30 years ago. Margaret had returned to Portland and thrown herself into her work. She had published papers, earned tenure, and eventually become the chair of her department. She had dated occasionally, even had a few relationships that lasted a year or two. But nothing had ever felt like what she'd had with Elena. Nothing had ever come close. She had learned to be content with her solitude. She had her books, her students, her small circle of close friends. She had her home, which she'd bought and renovated with care, filling it with art and antiques and the accumulated treasures of a life well lived. If somewhat lonely dot, she had followed Elena's life from a distance, the way one might check on an old wound to see if it still hurt. Through mutual acquaintances, she had learned that Elena had married Robert, had a daughter named Sarah, and continued her photography work, though she focused mainly on family portraits and wedding photography rather than the edgier artistic work she'd once pursued. Margaret had wondered sometimes if Elena was happy, if she had ever regretted her choice. But mostly she had tried not to think about it, to let the past remain in the past, until now. Until this letter that had arrived 3 days before Christmas, stirring up everything Margaret had worked so hard to bury. Margaret spent the next 2 days in turmoil. She went through the motions of her daily life, attending her book club meeting, having lunch with her colleague David, wrapping presents for her nieces and nephews. But underneath it all, Elena's letter burned in her mind. On the evening of December 22nd, Margaret sat down at her kitchen table with a glass of wine and a legal pad. She'd always been someone who processed emotions through writing. And now she made 2 lists: reasons to go to Pioneer Courthouse Square, and reasons to stay home. Closure after 30 years, the chance to see Elena one more time, the possibility of understanding why she left, the knowledge that if I don't go, I'll always wonder the small, foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, she regrets it. The recognition that I've lived too long with ghosts, it will hurt. It might hurt even more than the first time she left. I've built a good life without her. Some doors are better left closed. What if she's just looking to ease her own guilt? What if I'm still in love with her? She stared at the list for a long time, the wine slowly warming in her glass. The rational part of her mind said to stay home, to protect herself from potential pain. But there was another part, the part that had stood in a parking lot 30 years ago and watched the love of her life drive away. That needed to know how this story ended. Finally, around midnight, Margaret made her decision. She would go. Not because she expected anything, not because she thought they could somehow recapture what they'd lost, but because she owed it to her younger self, the woman who had loved so fully and lost so completely, to at least seek understanding. She went to bed that night and dreamed of jasmine and honey-colored eyes. December 23rd dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter day where the sky is impossibly blue and every breath creates small clouds of vapor. Margaret spent the morning in a state of nervous energy, changing her outfit 3 times before settling on dark jeans, boots, and a burgundy sweater that one of her friends had once said made her eyes look particularly green. She arrived at Pioneer Courthouse Square at 1:45 p.m., telling herself that being early would give her a chance to spot Elena first, to prepare herself. The Christmas market was in full swing, the square transformed into a winter wonderland of wooden stalls selling ornaments, hot cider, roasted nuts, and handcrafted gifts. The enormous Christmas tree in the center blazed with thousands of lights, and the air was filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine and the sound of carolers singing. Margaret positioned herself near the information booth, where she could see the tree but remained somewhat hidden in the crowd. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might bruise her ribs. At precisely 2 p.m., she saw her. Elena had aged, of course, but she had aged beautifully. Her dark curly hair was now streaked with silver and cut shorter, just brushing her shoulders. She wore a long camel coat and a blue scarf, and she moved through the crowd with a careful grace, scanning faces as she walked toward the tree. Margaret felt 30 years collapse in an instant. All the carefully constructed walls, all the moving on and moving forward. All of it dissolved and she was 32 again. Standing in a bookstore and having her world turned upside down by a smile, she stepped forward before she could change her mind. Elena? Elena turned, and when their eyes met, Margaret saw the same recognition. The same rush of emotion mirrored in her face. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Elena smiled, that same smile that had first captivated Margaret 3 decades ago, though now it carried the weight of years and choices and regret. You came, Elena said, her voice soft with wonder. I almost didn't, Margaret admitted. They stood there awkwardly for a moment. 2 women who had once known every inch of each other's bodies and souls. Now strangers separated by an ocean of lost time. Then Elena gestured toward a small cafe on the edge of the square. Could we talk? Somewhere quieter? Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. The cafe was warm and relatively empty, most people preferring to browse the outdoor market despite the cold. They ordered coffee, both of them black, both of them still remembering how the other took it, and settled into a corner booth. Elena cupped her hands around her mug as if trying to draw warmth from it. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure you should. Why did you reach out? Margaret asked, needing to understand. After 30 years, why now? Elena took a deep breath. My husband died, Robert. It's been a year now, cancer. I'm sorry, Margaret said, and meant it. Despite everything, she had no wish for Elena to suffer. He was a good man, Elena said quietly. Kind, patient, steady. He gave me Sarah, who is the light of my life. And he loved me in his way, never asking questions about my past, never pushing when I would get melancholy sometimes for reasons I couldn't explain. But? Margaret prompted, hearing the unspoken word hanging in the air. Elena's eyes filled with tears. But he wasn't you. And I spent 30 years pretending that was okay, that I had made the right choice, that safety and acceptance were more important than passion and truth. And then he died, and suddenly I was 64 years old and alone and realizing that I had wasted half my life living someone else's idea of what I should be. Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. That's not fair to him. Or to your daughter. I know, Elena said quickly. God, I know. And I don't mean it like that. I love Sarah desperately. She's the one thing I have no regrets about. And Robert was good to me. But Margaret, I lived a lie. I lived a comfortable, acceptable, approved of lie. And it ate away at me piece by piece until I barely recognized myself anymore. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn photograph, sliding it across the table. Margaret picked it up and felt her breath catch. It was from their trip to Cannon Beach, taken by a stranger they'd asked to snap their picture. They were standing with their arms around each other. The ocean behind them, both of them laughing at something. Their faces full of joy and freedom and love. I've carried this with me for 30 years, Elena said. Hidden in different places, depending on where I was living, who might see. But I kept it because I needed to remember that I was once brave enough to love you. Even if I wasn't brave enough to keep loving you. Margaret stared at the photograph, at these 2 young women who had no idea how their story would end. Why are you telling me this now? Because I need you to know that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life, Elena said, tears now streaming down her face. Because I need you to know that not a day has passed when I haven't thought about you, wondered what our life would have been like if I'd been strong enough to choose you. Because I'm running out of time to make things right. And even if it's too late, even if you hate me, I needed you to know the truth. Margaret sat back in the booth, feeling the weight of 3 decades pressing down on her. Part of her wanted to rage at Elena to make her understand the depth of the pain she caused. But another part, the part that had loved this woman with her whole heart, felt only a deep, aching sadness. Do you want to know what my life has been like? Margaret asked quietly. Because I think you should know if we're sharing truths. Elena nodded, bracing herself. I was devastated when you left. Absolutely destroyed. I lost 15 pounds because I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep without dreaming of you. I went through the motions at work, and somehow I didn't get fired, but I barely remember that first year without you. It was like living underwater. Elena's face crumpled, but Margaret continued. But eventually I surfaced. I built a life. Not the life I wanted, maybe, but a good life. I became chair of my department. I mentored students. I published a book on queer themes in Victorian literature that won awards. I bought a house. I traveled. I dated. I even fell in love again once or twice, though never quite the way I loved you. Margaret, let me finish, Margaret said gently. I need to say this. You made a choice 30 years ago and it broke my heart. But it also freed me in a way. I stopped hiding. I came out fully at work, in my family, in every aspect of my life. Because I realized that if I couldn't have you, at least I could have myself, completely and honestly. So in some strange way, your leaving made me braver than I might have been otherwise. Elena was openly weeping now. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I know you are, Margaret said. And I forgive you. I forgave you years ago, actually, because holding on to anger was too exhausting. But forgiveness doesn't mean we can go back. You understand that, don't you? Elena nodded, wiping at her eyes with a napkin. I don't expect us to go back. I just wanted to see you. To apologize. To let you know that you weren't wrong to love me. Even if I was too afraid to keep loving you back. They sat in silence for a moment. The noise of the cafe fading into background. Tell me about Sarah, Margaret said finally. Wanting to know about this piece of Elena's life that had been worth all the sacrifices. Elena's face lit up, grief giving way to joy. She's wonderful. Smart, funny, so much braver than I ever was. She's marrying a woman, actually. Amanda. They met in grad school. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Elena. I know, Elena said, laughing through her tears. The irony isn't lost on me. My daughter is living the life I was too afraid to live. And she's so happy, Margaret. So completely, unapologetically herself. When she came out to me at 19, I cried for 3 days. Robert thought I was upset, but I was crying because I was so proud of her and so angry at myself for not having her courage. Does she know? About us? Elena shook her head. Not specifically. But she knows there's something in my past I've never talked about. She's asked a few times. I think after the wedding, after she's settled into her own married life, I might tell her. She deserves to know her mother's full story. They left the cafe and walked through the Christmas market. 2 older women bundled against the cold, moving slowly through the crowd. Margaret found herself telling Elena about her life, the good and the bad, the successes and the loneliness, the way she had grown and changed. Elena shared stories about Sarah's childhood, about Robert's gentle patience, about her photography work and how she'd recently started doing more artistic pieces again. Returning to the style that had first defined her work, they stopped at various stalls, admiring handmade ornaments and tasting samples of peppermint bark. At one point, Elena picked up a small glass ornament shaped like a camera and smiled. Remember when you bought me that vintage camera for our first Christmas together? She asked. The Hasselblad, Margaret said, surprised she remembered. You said it was too expensive. It was. But it was also the most thoughtful gift anyone had ever given me. I still have it. I used it to take Sarah's senior portraits. Margaret felt a pang in her chest. Elena had kept pieces of their love, scattered through her life like hidden treasures. I kept things too, she admitted. Letters, photos, a book of poetry you gave me. They walked on and Margaret found herself relaxing, the initial tension giving way to something that felt almost like their old ease. They had lost so much, but perhaps the foundation of what they'd once had, the friendship, the understanding, the genuine connection was still there. Buried but not destroyed as the winter afternoon began to fade into evening. The lights of the Christmas market growing brighter against the darkening sky. They found themselves back at the big tree where they'd started. I should go, Elena said reluctantly. I'm having dinner with Sarah and Amanda. But Margaret, could we see each other again? While I'm in town. I understand if you'd rather not, but yes, Margaret said, surprising herself with how quickly she answered. I'd like that. They met again 2 days later. On Christmas Day, Margaret had finished her family obligations early brunch with her brother and his family, where she'd been the doting aunt bearing gifts. Elena had stolen away from Sarah's future in-law's dinner party. Claiming she needed some air, they walked through Laurelhurst Park, their breath making clouds in the cold air, and talked about everything and nothing. They discussed books and politics and their favorite films. They argued good-naturedly about whether the new adaptation of Pride and Prejudice was better than the BBC version. Margaret said no, Elena said yes. They laughed, genuinely laughed, and Margaret realized how much she'd missed that sound. The particular music of Elena's joy. "I want to show you something," Elena said as they circled back toward the parking lot. "If you have time?" Margaret had nothing but time. "Where are we going?" "My hotel. I have something I want you to see." In Elena's hotel room, tastefully decorated in shades of gray and blue, Elena pulled out a large portfolio case. She opened it carefully and began laying photographs on the bed. "I've been working on a new series," she explained. "I'm calling it The Roads Not Taken. It's portraits of people talking about their biggest regrets, their might have beens. I started it after Robert died as a way of processing my own feelings. But it became something bigger." Margaret looked at the photographs and they were stunning. Each image captured such raw vulnerability, such honest emotion. An elderly man staring at a photograph of a woman he'd never married. A former athlete looking at trophies from a career cut short by injury. A mother holding a letter from a child she'd given up for adoption. "These are extraordinary," Margaret said softly. "This is the kind of work you were always meant to do." "There's one more," Elena said, pulling out a final photograph. It was a self-portrait, Elena staring directly at the camera, her face a map of sorrow and longing. Behind her, barely visible, was the photograph from Cannon Beach, the image of two young women in love. Margaret's throat tightened. "Elena, I wanted you to see this. To know that I haven't forgotten. That some roads not taken haunt us forever." They stood there, close enough to touch, and Margaret felt the pull of history and memory and the ghost of what they'd been. It would be so easy to close the distance, to fall back into the familiar comfort of Elena's arms. But Margaret had learned hard lessons about the difference between what was and what could be. "I can't," she said quietly. "I can't be your absolution or your what if. I've spent too long building a life that isn't defined by longing for you." Elena's face fell, but she nodded. "I know, I wasn't asking you to be. I just wanted you to understand." "I do understand," Margaret said, and she did. She understood regret and loss and the particular pain of wondering what might have been. But she also understood that some doors, once closed, should stay that way. Not out of bitterness or spite, but out of respect for the people they'd both become in the years apart. The week passed in a series of meetings that felt both too long and too short. They had coffee on Monday, lunch on Wednesday. A visit to Powell's bookstore on Friday where they browsed the shelves and bought books for each other the way they used to. Each time, the conversation grew easier but also more bittersweet. They were finding their way back to friendship. But the shadow of what they'd lost lingered. On December 28th, Sarah's wedding day, Margaret was surprised to receive a text from Elena. "Would you like to come to the wedding? As my friend? Sarah says she'd love to meet you. No pressure if it's too much." Margaret stared at her phone for a long time. Attending Elena's daughter's wedding felt like crossing some invisible line, stepping into a life that had gone on without her. But it also felt like an honor, an acknowledgement of what they'd meant to each other. She texted back, "I'd be honored." The wedding was held at a small, elegant venue in the Pearl District, decorated with white lights and winter flowers. Margaret arrived feeling nervous and out of place, but Elena met her at the door with a warm hug. "Thank you for coming," Elena said. "This means so much to me." Sarah was beautiful in a simple ivory dress, her dark hair crowned with tiny white flowers. When Elena introduced them, Sarah studied Margaret with intelligent eyes that reminded Margaret so much of her mother. "It's nice to finally meet you," Sarah said. "Mom's talked about you." Margaret raised her eyebrows at Elena, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I may have mentioned that I ran into an old friend while I was in town. The ceremony was lovely, full of joy and tears and laughter." Sarah and Amanda exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to be brave together, to create a life built on honesty and love. Margaret found herself crying, thinking about the different paths life could take, the choices that defined us, the courage required to live authentically. At the reception, Margaret sat at Elena's table, meeting Sarah's friends and various relatives. She watched Elena photograph the event, saw how her face lit up behind the camera. How she captured not just images but moments of pure emotion. This was Elena in her element, and Margaret was glad she'd gotten to see it. Late in the evening, when the dancing had started and the lights had been dimmed, Elena found Margaret on the venue's terrace, looking out at the city lights. "Thank you for being here," Elena said, joining her at the railing. "It wouldn't have felt complete without you." "She's wonderful, your daughter. You should be proud." "I am. She's everything I wish I'd had the courage to be." They stood in comfortable silence, the sound of music and laughter drifting out from inside. "I'm going back to Sacramento on Monday," Elena said finally. "But I want you to know these past few days have meant everything to me. You've given me a gift. I didn't deserve the chance to know that you're okay, that you've built a good life, though I didn't completely destroy you when I left." Margaret turned to look at her. "You didn't destroy me. You broke my heart, but I healed. And maybe in some ways I needed to break to become who I am now." "I wish I could have been brave enough to build a life with you," Elena said softly. "I wish I could go back and tell my younger self that love is worth fighting for, even when the world makes it hard." "But we can't go back," Margaret said. "We can only go forward." "I know. But maybe going forward doesn't have to mean saying goodbye forever?" Margaret considered this. "What are you suggesting?" "Friendship," Elena said. "Real friendship. Phone calls and emails and maybe visits when I'm in town. I know it's not what we had, but it's something. And I think I'd like to have you in my life if you're willing." Margaret thought about it. She thought about the girl she'd been at 32, so terrified of losing Elena that she'd held on too tight. She thought about the woman she'd become, strong enough to know that love took many forms. That sometimes the greatest act of love was letting go of what was and embracing what could be. "I'd like that," she said finally. "But we take it slow. We build something new, not try to resurrect what's dead." Elena smiled, relieved. "Slow, new, I can do that." The baby shower was held in early spring at Sarah and Amanda's craftsman-style home in the Hawthorne district. Margaret arrived with a box of cookies and a carefully wrapped gift, vintage children's book collection she'd found at an estate sale. First editions of Goodnight Moon and Where the Wild Things Are. Elena opened the door, and they hugged with the easy affection that had developed between them over the past 2 years. Elena looked radiant, her silver hair catching the afternoon light, wearing a flowing dress in sage green. "You made it," Elena said warmly. Come in, come in." Sarah's been asking when you'd arrive." The house was filled with people Amanda's large Italian family, Sarah's friends from grad school, and several of Elena's relatives who Margaret was meeting for the first time. She felt a flutter of nervousness, aware that she was one of the few people in the room who knew Elena's full story. Sarah found her immediately, 8 months pregnant and glowing. "Margaret, thank you so much for coming. And for the cookies, I may have already stolen 2 from the kitchen." "They're all yours," Margaret laughed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm carrying a watermelon. But a watermelon I already love more than anything." Sarah's hand rested on her belly. "Mom tells me you were her favorite professor at Portland State. She audited one of your classes, apparently." Margaret glanced at Elena in surprise. She'd never known that Elena had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "It was after we reconnected. I wanted to see you in your element. You were brilliant, by the way. Your lecture on Virginia Woolf had half the class in tears." Before Margaret could respond, Amanda called everyone to the living room for games. The afternoon passed in a blur of laughter, ridiculous baby shower games, and the opening of an alarming number of gifts. Margaret found herself seated next to Elena's sister Lucia, a warm woman in her 60s who owned a bakery in Sacramento. "So you're the famous Margaret," Lucia said with a knowing smile during a quiet moment. Margaret's heart skipped. "I don't know about famous. Elena talks about you. More in the last 2 years than in the previous 30 combined." Lucia studied her with kind eyes. "I'm glad she found you again. I'm glad you let her back into your life. My sister carried a lot of regret for a very long time." "We were young," Margaret said carefully. "We all make choices we wish we could change. Some of us make choices based on fear, and we pass that fear on to our children." Lucia glanced over at where Elena was laughing with Sarah. "But sometimes we get a second chance to show them a different way. Thank you for being part of that." Later, as guests began to leave, Margaret helped clean up in the kitchen. Elena joined her, drying dishes as Margaret washed. "Did Lucia give you the third degree?" Elena asked with a slight smile. "More like a blessing, I think." Elena was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling on the dish towel. "I told her. Last Christmas. About us, about everything. She said she'd always wondered why I seemed so sad those first few years with Robert. How did she take it? She cried. Then she hugged me and told me she wished I'd trusted her enough to tell her sooner. She said she would have supported me no matter what." Elena's voice caught. "All those years I spent being afraid. And the people who really loved me would have understood all along." Margaret set down the plate she was washing and turned to face Elena. "That's one of the hardest lessons to learn, that love, real love, doesn't come with conditions. That the people worth having in our lives will see us for who we are and love us anyway." "You've been very gracious with me," Elena said quietly. "More than I deserved." "Stop saying that. You deserved grace then, and you deserve it now." They finished the dishes in comfortable silence. And as Margaret gathered her things to leave, Sarah stopped her at the door. "Would you be willing to be in the baby's life?" Sarah asked. "Not as a grandmother or anything formal, but as, I don't know, an honorary aunt? Mom talks about you like your family, and Amanda and I could use all the wisdom we can get." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I would be honored." That evening, Margaret met Claire for dinner at their favorite Italian restaurant in Northwest Portland. Claire listened as Margaret recounted the baby shower, her expression warm and open. "You're going to be someone's honorary aunt," Claire said, raising her wine glass in a toast. "That's wonderful, Maggie." Margaret clinked her glass against Claire's, struck once again by how easy things were with this woman. They'd been together for 18 months now. And while it lacked the passionate intensity of what she'd had with Elena, it had something perhaps more valuable: stability. Companionship, mutual respect. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said as they waited for their entrees. "Does it bother you that Elena is back in my life?" Claire considered this, as she considered everything thoughtfully and without rushing to judgment. "Honestly, sometimes I wonder if I'm competing with a ghost. But then I remind myself that you're here with me, that you chose to build something with me. And I trust that choice." "There's no competition," Margaret said firmly. "What I had with Elena it was everything at the time. But it's also over. We're friends now, and that's all we'll ever be. You're my present and my future, if you want to be." "If I want to be," Claire repeated with a gentle smile. "That's a big statement." "Too big?" Margaret asked, suddenly nervous. "No, not too big at all." Claire reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "I love you, Maggie. I think I've been waiting to say that for months now, but I wanted to be sure you had room in your heart for it." "I do," Margaret said, and realized it was true. Her heart, which she thought Elena had broken beyond repair, had somehow expanded enough to hold both the memory of an old love and the reality of a new one. "I love you too." The call came at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in late April. Margaret fumbled for her phone, her heart pounding with the middle-of-the-night certainty that something was wrong. "Margaret?" "It's Elena. Sarah's in labor. She wanted me to call you." Margaret was instantly awake. "Is she okay?" "She's perfect." Terrified, but perfect. "We're at OHCU. I know it's the middle of the night, but Sarah specifically asked if you'd come. She says you're her good luck charm." "I'll be there in 20 minutes." She threw on clothes and drove through the empty streets, arriving at the hospital just as dawn was beginning to break over the city. Elena met her in the waiting room, looking exhausted and exhilarated. "They're letting family in 2 at a time. She wants you to come back." In the birthing room, Sarah was in the midst of contractions, Amanda holding her hand and whispering encouragement. Sarah's face was flushed and sweaty, but when she saw Margaret, she managed a tired smile. "You came." "Of course I came." Margaret moved to the other side of the bed, taking Sarah's free hand. "You're doing amazingly." The next few hours were a blur of intensity and waiting, of Sarah's cries and Amanda's steady support, and Elena documenting everything with her camera, tears streaming down her face behind the lens. Margaret found herself swept up in the profound intimacy of it all, this moment of life beginning, of family being formed. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy girl with a shock of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead, Margaret felt something shift in her heart. Elena was crying openly now. Meeting Margaret's eyes across the room with an expression of wonder and gratitude, they named her Rose Elena, after both grandmothers, and when Sarah asked if Margaret would hold her, Margaret cradled the tiny life in her arms and felt the weight of the future. All the possibility and promise that this new person represented. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to a world that's going to love you exactly as you are." Over the next year, Margaret became a fixture in Rose's life. She babysat when Sarah and Amanda needed date nights. She read stories and sang lullabies and marveled at every tiny milestone. Claire came to many of these occasions too, and gradually became part of the extended family that was forming around this child. Elena visited Portland more frequently now, staying with Sarah and Amanda to help with the baby. Sometimes she and Margaret would take Rose for walks in the park. Two older women pushing a stroller and talking about everything and nothing, one autumn afternoon. As they watched Rose chase leaves in Laurelhurst Park, Elena said, "I never imagined this, you know? That we'd end up here, part of each other's lives in this way." "Life is strange," Margaret agreed. "We lose what we thought we couldn't live without, and then we find new things to love in the spaces that loss created." "I've been thinking about moving back to Portland," Elena said quietly. "Not to be close to you necessarily, though that would be a lovely side benefit, but to be near Sarah and Rose, to be part of their daily lives while I still can." Margaret felt a complex swirl of emotions: pleasure, anxiety, hope, caution. "That's a big decision." "It is. But Sacramento doesn't feel like home anymore. It hasn't for a long time. Portland is where my daughter is, where my granddaughter is, where my art career first started, where," she trailed off, "where we were," Margaret finished. "Yes, but also where I might finally figure out who I am. Separate from all the roles I've played." Elena watched Rose tumble into a pile of leaves, giggling with pure joy. "I started therapy again. Did I tell you?" "You mentioned it. My therapist asked me what I want for the next chapter of my life, and I realized I want to stop living in the shadow of my regrets. I want to make art that matters. I want to be present for my granddaughter. I want to build authentic friendships. I want to date women openly without shame." She glanced at Margaret. "Not you, obviously, but women. I want to finally live the life I was too afraid to live at 35. Margaret felt proud of her, this woman who had broken her heart and then, slowly, helped her heal it in a completely different way. "I think that sounds wonderful. Scary, but wonderful. Will it be weird for you if I move here?" Margaret considered this honestly. "Maybe a little at first. But Claire is secure enough in our relationship, and I'm secure enough in who I've become. And Rose deserves to have her grandmother nearby. So yes, it might be weird sometimes, but I think we can handle weird." Elena laughed. "We've already handled 30 years of weird. What's a little more?" Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the snow fall just as she had 2 years earlier. But this time, the envelope on her table didn't carry the weight of regret and lost time. It was an invitation. Sarah and Amanda were having a baby, and they wanted Margaret to be at the shower. Over the past 2 years, she and Elena had slowly, carefully built a friendship. They talked on the phone every few weeks. They emailed each other articles and book recommendations. Elena had visited Portland 3 times, and each time they'd spent a day together, wandering the city, talking about their lives. There was no romance, no rekindling of what had been. But there was something perhaps more valuable: genuine affection, mutual respect, and the comfort of being known by someone who had witnessed your younger self. They talked about Elena's new photography exhibit, about Margaret's upcoming retirement from teaching, about the small joys and sorrows of daily life. Elena had started therapy, working through her regrets and learning to forgive herself for choices she couldn't change. She'd come out to Sarah, told her the whole story, and Sarah had responded with love and understanding, even seeking Margaret out for coffee to thank her for being kind to her mother when she didn't have to be. Margaret had started dating again, cautiously. A woman named Claire, a librarian with kind eyes and steady hands, who understood that Margaret's heart had scars but was still capable of love. It was gentle and sweet and uncomplicated, and Margaret found herself happy in a way she hadn't expected to be again. She picked up her phone and texted, "Elena, congratulations on becoming a grandmother. I'll be at the shower. Should I bring something blue?" The response came quickly, "Bring yourself. And maybe those amazing chocolate chip cookies you made last time. Sarah's been craving them. Thank you for being part of our lives. It means more than you know." Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with longing or loss, and everything to do with the quiet satisfaction of a story that had found, if not the ending it might have had, then an ending that brought peace. She had loved Elena with all her heart. She had lost her and mourned her and learned to live without her. And now, in this unexpected coda to their story, she had found a way to keep her in her life without being haunted by what might have been. Sometimes, Margaret thought as she began gathering ingredients for cookies, the roads not taken lead us exactly where we need to be.